The court of Valdenmoor had a tradition. Every 5 years, on the eve of the sovereignty rite, the ceremony that renewed the Alpha King's claim over the 7 territories, a seer was brought before the full assembly to render the kingdom's fate in paint, not in words. Words could be softened, reinterpreted, buried in footnotes and diplomatic phrasing. Paint could not. Paint was permanent and specific, and it stayed on the canvas long after the person who made it was gone, available to anyone who wanted to look at it and decide what it meant. The seers were always Omegas. This was not coincidence. The old texts were explicit on the point. The gift of true sight required a particular quality of surrender, a willingness to receive rather than impose, to become a vessel rather than a wielder. The powerful, the texts noted, almost never had this quality. Power and surrender moved in opposite directions. An alpha who had spent decades bending the world to their will was structurally incapable of letting go of that grip long enough for anything true to come through. So, it was always Omegas. Specifically always Omegas who had been tested, trained, and certified by the Office of the Sovereignty Seer, a body that reported directly to the High Council, which reported directly to the King. In theory, the process was sacred and inviolable. In practice, it had been managed carefully for several decades by a High Council that understood the value of prophecy that confirmed rather than challenged. This year, something had gone wrong. Sable had not been the Council's choice. She had not been anyone's choice, in the formal sense. She was 23 years old, Omega-born, and had been employed for the past 2 years as a secondary instructor at the Valdenmoor Institute for Sight-Gifted Omegas, which was a prestigious name for a place that identified young Omegas with prophetic ability, and then spent a great deal of effort teaching them to be precise, modest, and above all manageable. She was blind. Had been since birth, not impaired, not partially sighted, but completely, permanently, profoundly, without vision of any kind. She had never seen light. She had never seen color. She navigated the world through sound and touch, and the particular spatial awareness that develops in people whose other senses have had to compensate. And she was extraordinarily good at it, good enough that most people forgot within 10 minutes of meeting her, and then felt a complicated guilt about forgetting. The gift was different in her than in other seers. This was documented. Several of her instructors had noted it with a mixture of professional excitement and personal unease. Most seers with the sight experienced their visions as images, flashes, sequences, scenes overlaid on ordinary vision like a second transparency. Sable experienced hers as certainty, a deep, structural knowing that settled into her the way temperature settles into stone, not dramatic, not arresting, simply present and absolute, and impossible to argue with. She painted what she knew, not what she saw. The distinction mattered more than most people understood. The Council's certified seer for this year's sovereignty rite had collapsed 3 days before the ceremony. Fever, the official announcement said. A sudden illness, deeply unfortunate. Everyone wished her a swift recovery. Sable, who had attended the woman's morning lesson 2 days before the collapse and found her in perfect health and somewhat better spirits than usual, noted the timing privately and said nothing about it publicly. She was summoned the following morning. Lord Casson, the High Council's primary liaison to the seer's office, came himself. He was a man she had encountered twice before. She knew his footstep, the particular rhythm of someone who walked as if expecting the floor to confirm his importance with every step. And both times the meeting had left her with the specific, settled feeling of standing near something that had gone quietly rotten without bothering to announce it. "You understand what is being asked," he said. It was not a question. "I understand what the sovereignty rite requires," she said. "I understand that the certified seer is unavailable. I understand that the ceremony cannot be postponed." She paused. "I am less certain I understand all of what is being asked." A short silence, in which she could hear him reassessing. "The ceremony follows a clear form," he said. "The seer enters. The seer paints. The painting is displayed and interpreted by the council's readers. Another pause, almost imperceptible. The readings are announced to the assembly. The readings, Sable said, not the painting itself. The painting is symbolic. It requires contextual interpretation to be meaningful, she said softly. Accessible, he corrected. And she had been born blind and had spent 23 years understanding exactly what people meant when they said things they were not quite saying. She understood Lord Casson perfectly. I will need my own paints, she said, and my own brushes. A beat, of course. And I will need to know, she said, that what I paint will be displayed exactly as I produce it, without alteration, without interpretation, before the assembly sees it. The silence that followed was longer. That is the traditional form, Casson said finally. His voice had acquired a careful quality, like someone walking on ground they have just realized may not be solid. Then we are agreed, Sable said. She was given a room in the palace's east wing the night before the ceremony. It was a large room, she could tell by the sound her footsteps made. The way they expanded and returned. With high ceilings and a window she could feel the cold coming through, and a bed that was softer than anything she had slept on in her 2 years at the Institute. She did not sleep. She sat on the floor in the center of the room, her hands open in her lap, and she let the knowing come. This was not something she could explain to people who asked about her process. There was no process exactly. There was only the act of becoming quiet enough, still enough, empty enough of her own preferences and fears and wishes, that the truth of a thing could move through her without distortion. It was less like receiving a message, and more like removing the obstacles between herself and something that was already there, already complete, waiting only for sufficient silence to be heard. She had known, before Lord Casson arrived, that she would be asked to do this. She had known, with the same absolute settled certainty, what she was going to paint. She had been sitting with that knowledge for 3 days, not because she was uncertain about it. She was never uncertain about what she knew, only about what to do with it. But because she understood what it was going to cost her. She was not naive about the court of Valdenmoor. She was not naive about what happened to Omegas, who became inconvenient in ways that were difficult to quietly manage. She sat in the large, dark room, dark by everyone's measure now, not only hers, and she thought about cost, and about what it meant to have a gift you had never asked for, that showed you true things and required you to decide, every single time, whether truth was worth what it charged. Or by the time the palace began to wake around her, audible through the walls in the particular way of large buildings that never fully sleep, she had her answer. She always had the same answer. That was the thing. She could sit with the question for days, could examine the cost from every angle, could be entirely clear-eyed about the risk. And she always arrived at the same place. Because the alternative was not safety. The alternative was becoming the kind of person who knew the truth and chose not to say it. And she had watched what that did to people over time, had felt the quality of it in rooms where it had been practiced for long enough, and it was worse, in ways that didn't wash off. She opened her paint case. She ran her fingers over each container, reading the small raised labels she had made for herself, her own code, developed over years, a private language of texture and position. She selected her brushes by the feel of the bristles. She was ready. The Hall of Sovereignty seated 400. It was designed for maximum theatrical impact. Sable could feel this in the acoustics, the way sound moved in the space, the particular resonance of a room built to impress. The canvas was set up on a raised platform at the center, visible from every seat. She had been told it was 8 feet by 6, which was larger than anything she had worked on before. She had asked for this herself. Size mattered for what was coming. Not for her, but for the people who would see it. She heard the assembly settle as she was led to the platform. 400 people, and the sound they made was not quite silence. It was the specific, charged quality of breath held collectively. She was aware of herself as they were seeing her. Small, slight, young, dressed in the formal white of a sovereignty seer that had clearly been altered hastily to fit her. The thin white cane she used in unfamiliar spaces tapping the elevated floor as she was guided to her position. She heard the whispers. She always heard the whispers. She's blind. How is she supposed to? The council couldn't find anyone else. She looks like a child. She set her cane aside. She found the table where her paints had been arranged by her own hands that morning, confirming each position with her fingers before she stepped away. She picked up the first brush. The hall went completely quiet. She had learned over years of working that this was the moment people were most uncertain, the moment before she began, when the question of how this was supposed to work was still unresolved. She had learned not to acknowledge the uncertainty. She simply began. She found the canvas with her left hand, palm flat, establishing scale and position. She did this deliberately, knowing how it looked, the blind woman mapping the canvas with her hands before she painted, and knowing also that it was not performance. It was simply how she worked, and she had long since stopped adjusting her process for the comfort of audiences who found it unsettling. The first brushstroke was crimson. She felt the paint leave the bristles, felt the canvas receive it, felt, in the way she always felt these things, from the inside rather than the outside, where it needed to go. Her hand was completely steady. It had always been steady. And she thought sometimes that this was the gift's most practical manifestation, the utter absence of doubt in the moment of making. She was never more certain of anything than she was in the act of translating what she knew into what she could put on a surface. Crimson. Then a deeper red, almost black at the center. She knew these colors not by sight, but by a lifetime of learning them from every other direction. Their smell, their texture, the weight of them on a brush, the way people described them when she asked, the metaphors they used. Crimson was urgent and old. The color of things that had been building for a long time and were only now becoming visible. She began to build the composition. She heard the assembly start to react in the slow, incremental way of people processing something they had not expected. A murmur, then quiet. Then the murmur again, different in quality, lower, more uncertain. She heard the sound of people leaning toward their neighbors. She heard someone, a woman, near the front, with the careful diction of someone highly placed, draw a sharp breath. She kept painting. The Alpha King was seated at the head of the hall on an elevated platform, visible to the entire assembly. She could not see him, but she was aware of him in the way she was aware of sources of heat, as a concentration of something, a density of presence that organized the room around itself. She had been in his proximity twice before, once at a formal institute demonstration 3 years ago, once in a receiving line at a Sovereignty Eve preliminary. Both times she had received the same impression she was receiving now, of someone substantial and controlled, and deeply, fundamentally unaware of what was moving toward him. Not evil. She had been in the presence of evil, had felt its specific quality. This was different. This was a man who had been making decisions for so long inside a system that confirmed those decisions, that he had lost the ability to distinguish between his own judgment and the judgments being quietly made for him. He was not corrupt. He was managed. The difference was important, and it was part of what the canvas was going to show. She heard the sound change again. The quality of the breathing in the room shifted, deeper, less controlled. Someone near the back made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word. Lord Cassin's voice reached her from the side of the platform, very quiet, intended for her alone. "Perhaps you might—" "No," she said. She did not stop painting. A longer silence from his direction. She heard him step back. The figures were taking shape. She knew this not by sight, but by the mapping of her left hand, which moved with the brush at intervals, reading the surface the way she would read text. She knew where she was in the composition. She knew what remained. She reached for the black. The murmuring in the hall stopped completely. 400 people, and the silence they made now was not the silence of held breath, but the silence of something colder. The silence of people confronting something they had been hoping not to see, and could no longer look away from. She worked steadily. She worked without hurry. She worked with the particular quality of concentration that exists on the other side of fear. Not the absence of understanding what this would cost, but the presence of having already paid it forward, already accepted it, already made the trade. The composition showed the Alpha King. She had never seen him, but she painted him from knowing. The shape of authority, the architecture of a man who had been powerful for so long that power had become structural, visible in the way he held himself, even in representations she had encountered in tactile form, even in the way people's voices changed when they spoke of him. She painted him true, which meant she painted him as he was, rather than as he was represented, not diminished, not demonized, but stripped of the careful curation that surrounded him. Honest. And around him. This was what the room was reacting to. She understood. This was what was making the breathing change. She painted what was coming. Not death, exactly. She had always been precise about this distinction. The sight did not show death, except in the metaphorical sense that all endings are a kind of death. What it showed was consequence. What it showed was the shape of a thing that had been set in motion long ago and was now too far along its arc to be redirected by anything except the most fundamental change. She painted the council. She painted Lord Casson. She painted the space around the throne where the advisors stood, and she painted it in the colors of what they were rather than what they appeared, and these colors were not flattering, and they were specific. And she heard the precise moment when enough of the assembly had seen enough to understand what they were looking at, because the silence in the room changed for the third time, and became something she had no single word for. Something that was fear and recognition, and the particular awful relief of a thing being named that everyone had known, and no one had said. She set her brush down. She found her cane. She stepped back from the canvas. The Hall of Sovereignty was utterly, completely, extraordinarily silent. She was in that silence for approximately 15 seconds before Lord Casson moved. She heard him approach the platform, his footstep different now, the confidence-confirming rhythm disrupted into something faster and less regular. She heard 2 others behind him. Guards, by the weight and pattern of it. "The reading," he began, "will be conducted by the assembly." The voice that interrupted him came from the far left of the hall, elevated, carrying the particular resonance of a speaking position designed to project. She did not know the voice. It was female, older, with the quality of someone accustomed to being heard. As the traditional form prescribes, the painting is visible to all present. The council's readers have no special claim on its interpretation. A pause. "Lady Vane," Casson started. "Article 7 of the Sovereignty Accords," Lady Vane said. Her voice was completely calm. "The rendering is the property of the Assembly. It will not be removed, altered, or interpreted exclusively by any single body." A beat. "I believe we are all looking at it. I believe we all know what we are looking at." The silence shifted. In it, for Sable heard the specific sound of 400 people making decisions. She heard Casson's breathing. It had changed in a way that told her a great deal. "The girl needs to be," he began. "The seer," said Lady Vane with a precision that was not aggressive, but was absolutely final, "needs to be thanked, and seated, and offered water, which I suspect she has not been given." A pause in which Sable heard the rustle of someone standing. "I will see to it myself." Footsteps approaching. Measured, unhurried, coming directly to her. A hand found her arm, gentle, not grabbing, offering rather than directing. "My name is Vane," the woman said, close and quiet. "I have been watching this court for 30 years. I have seen 6 sovereignty rites and 6 paintings, and not one of them has said a true thing." A pause. Yours said several. I know, Sable said. Are you frightened? Sable considered the question honestly. I was frightened 3 days ago, she said. I'm not anymore. No, the woman said, with something in her voice that was not quite admiration, and not quite grief, but moved between them. I imagine not. That is what it looks like when someone has already decided. She guided Sable gently toward the side of the platform. There is a chair, 3 steps down. Sable found the steps. She sat. Around her, the hall was beginning to unravel in the way that halls unravel when something irrevocable has happened, not collapsing, not erupting, but reorganizing. She could hear it in the movement of people, in the conversations breaking out in low, urgent tones, as in the sound of official positions shifting as the people who held them tried to determine what they were now positioned relative to. She heard Lord Casson leave. She heard, some time later, the sound of the Alpha King moving. His footstep was distinctive. She had been cataloging it since she entered the hall. It came down from the elevated platform and across the floor toward her, and it was not accompanied by the usual constellation of attendants and advisors. It was alone. He stopped in front of her. She waited. I want to understand, he said, what I am looking at. His voice was not what she had expected. She had built a voice for him in her imagination from the impressions she had received in his presence, from the way others spoke of him, from the general quality of very powerful men who had held power for a long time. She had expected something more armored. What she heard instead was something direct and unsettled, and underneath that, something she recognized because she had heard it in herself. The specific quality of a person confronting something they had suspected for a long time, and were only now, in this specific moment, allowing to be confirmed. What do you see? She asked. A pause. A throne, he said. Mine, surrounded by shadows I recognize. Another pause. Longer. Men I have trusted. For a very long time. Yes. And the crimson. She waited. It does not read as my death, he said. Slowly, carefully, as if he were translating something in real time. When I first saw it, I thought it was a death painting. But it isn't. No, she said. It is the end of something. He was quiet for a moment. The end of how things have been. Not the man, the arrangement. The arrangement, she confirmed. A longer silence. How long have you known this? He asked. Since I was certified, she said honestly. 2 years. The knowing is not always precise in its timing, but the shape of it has been the same. Why, he stopped, started again. The council's seer, the one who fell ill. I cannot tell you what I don't know, she said carefully. I can tell you what I observed. Tell me, she told him. The lesson 2 days before. The woman in good health, better spirits than usual, the particular lightness of someone who has just been relieved of a responsibility. She told him without editorializing, without the interpretation that would shade it beyond what she actually knew. She gave him the facts and let him do what he did with them. Hati was quiet for a long time. Around them, the hall continued its slow reorganization. She could hear it happening, something shifting in the architecture of the room's allegiances. A gradual movement like tectonic plates, almost imperceptible but accumulating. You understood what they wanted, he said finally, when Cassin came to you. Yes. You understood what would happen if you painted the truth. I had a reasonable estimate. And you did it anyway. She thought about the 3 days of sitting with it, the same question examined from every angle, arriving at the same place. I couldn't do otherwise, she said. I've tried that. Being the kind of person who knows and doesn't say. It costs more than the alternative. He was quiet, then unexpectedly. What does the painting show that I cannot see? She tilted her head. I mean, what does it show that is not visible in the image itself? You made it. You know it from the inside. His voice had changed again. The unsettled quality was still there, but something else had joined it. Something she needed a moment to identify. Openness. The specific, vulnerable quality of someone who has decided to stop managing the information they receive and simply receive it. Tell me what it means. She folded her hands in her lap. It means, she said, that the kingdom is not in danger from its enemies. It has been in danger from its own internal structure for a generation. Decisions that were made, or not made, by people who were protecting their position rather than their purpose. She paused. The crimson is not bloodshed. It is urgency. The color of something that needed to change a long time ago, and has been waiting. She turned her face toward where she understood him to be standing. The figures in shadow are not your enemies in the traditional sense. They are people who have been making choices on your behalf and allowing you to believe those choices were yours. The silence that followed was very still. Lord Casson, he said, and others. I don't know all of them. The sight shows shapes, not names. But Casson? Yes, she paused. The certified seer who fell ill is not ill. No, he said. I don't believe she is. A long pause. The painting ends, she said carefully. Not in destruction. In a threshold. The figure on the throne is at a doorway. What happens at the threshold depends on what the figure chooses. She paused. The painting cannot show what is not yet determined. That part is yours. He was quiet for so long that she began to hear the room more clearly. Lady Vane's voice somewhere to her right, conducting something with the organized efficiency of a person who has been waiting for an opportunity and had come prepared. Guards' footsteps, moving in new patterns. You could have painted something else, he said finally. His voice was different again, stripped further down, nearer to whatever was at the bottom of it. Something that showed what the council wanted. Something that confirmed rather than... No, she said gently. I couldn't. A pause. Because of the gift. Because of who I am. She turned her face toward him again. The gift and the person are not separable. If I were the kind of person who could make that choice, the gift would not have come to me. She paused. That is not modesty. That is how it works. True sight requires a particular quality of, not courage, exactly. Indifference to the cost of honesty. It finds the people who have learned to live with that indifference. Usually, she said with a small, honest inflection, because they haven't had the option of anything else. Another silence, a different quality to this one. You grew up at the Institute, he said. I was placed there at 7. Before that, she paused. A provincial Omega house, she said. Similar to several others. Similar to Ashwell, he said. And there was something in the way he said it, like a name he had encountered recently, in a context that had altered his understanding of certain things. Similar to the places where the children no one claimed go to learn to ask for very little. She said nothing, because there was nothing to add. He had said it accurately. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. That is insufficient, I know, but I owe it. The system that produced those places operates on my authority, or has been operating on authority it claimed was mine. His voice was careful and honest. I am beginning to understand the difference. She thought about what to say. The painting, she said finally, shows a threshold, not an end. She paused. That was deliberate. Whatever happens in this room today, whatever you decide, there is still a doorway. There is still a choice available. She folded her hands more firmly in her lap. I painted what I knew. I also painted what I hoped. They are not always the same thing. A long, still pause. What did you hope? He asked. She thought about it honestly. About the 3 days of sitting in the dark with the question. About the cost she had accepted and the reason she had accepted it. Not only the obligation of the gift, Not only the indifference to consequence that the sight required, but something underneath both of those things. Something smaller and more personal. Something that had less to do with prophecy and more to do with a woman who had grown up in rooms where the powerful made decisions about the powerless with comfortable certainty that this was simply how things were, and who had spent her entire adult life being the still, steady, indifferent to cost one in situations that required exactly that, and who had wondered privately whether it would ever matter, and whether the steadiness would ever land on a surface capable of receiving it. I hoped, she said, that the person on the throne was someone who could be told the truth and would not punish the telling. She paused. That is a smaller hope than it sounds. In my experience, it is also rarer. The hall around them had shifted considerably. She could hear it in everything. In Lady Vane's organized movement somewhere to her right, in the guards' new configurations, in the changed acoustics of a room where 400 people were no longer holding themselves in careful neutrality. Kassan is gone, the Alpha King said. Not as information for her, she had heard it, but as a thing he was saying aloud for the first time, making real. Yes. He won't get far. No, she said. I don't think he will. A pause. Then, quietly, yet without performance, I have been on the throne for 16 years. In that time I have received 6 prophecy paintings. Each one was read to me by council readers and told me that the kingdom was stable, that my authority was sound, that the path forward was the path I was already on. His voice was very even. It did not occur to me, or I did not allow it to occur to me, that stable and stagnant are not the same thing. She said nothing. Sometimes the important thing was simply to let a thing be said. I want to see it, he said. The painting. I want to look at it, to continue looking at it, without anyone explaining it to me. That is, she said, exactly what it is for. He paused. Then, will you tell me what you see in it? Not what it shows, what you see. You made it from the inside. You know it in a way I can't access from the outside. She thought about this, about what it meant to be asked by this specific person in this specific moment to share the inside of a thing she had made. Yes, she said. I'll tell you. He sat down, not on the throne, not on an official chair. He sat on the steps of the platform, which were not far from where she was seated, and the sound of it was so ordinary and unannounced, a man sitting down because he had things to consider and legs that had been carrying him through a long morning, that she felt something shift in her chest in a way that was small and significant and had nothing to do with prophecy. Start from the left, he said. She began. She described the composition the way she knew it, from the inside, from the making of it, from the certainty that had moved through her hands and onto the canvas. She described what each element meant, not in the formal language of seer interpretation, but in the direct, plain language she used when she was being most honest. She described the crimson and what urgency looked like when you painted it without apology. She described the shadows and the specific quality of the faces she had given them. Not monstrous, not cartoonishly villainous, because that was not what they were. They were ordinary faces of ordinary men who had made small compromises for long enough that the small compromises had become the shape of them. She described the threshold. The figure at the threshold, he said, is looking outward. Yes. Not backward. No. She paused. Backward was not an option I painted. I painted what the sight showed. The sight did not show backward as available. She paused again. I think that is correct. It feels correct, he said, and she heard in his voice what she heard in her own when she said something she had known for a long time, without having the words for it. There are things I have not examined. Choices I believed I was making that were being made around me, with my name on them. I have known this, in some part of myself, for longer than I have allowed myself to know it. Yes, she said, that is what the painting shows. It does not condemn me. No. It holds me responsible, he said, with the careful precision of someone identifying something important. That is different from condemnation. Considerably, she said. He was quiet for a while. Around them, the hall was continuing its transformation, the sound of it, the gradual reorganization of allegiances and positions that happened when a fixed point shifted. Lady Vane's voice, conducting. Other voices she didn't know, responding. The guards' new configurations becoming habitual, becoming normal. You said the gift finds people with a particular indifference to the cost of honesty, he said. Yes. That indifference was not chosen. No, she said. It was built by circumstance, by growing up in places where honesty was the only currency that didn't depreciate. She paused. I didn't choose to be the kind of person who cannot lie about what she knows. I simply could never afford to be anything else. And now? She tilted her head. Now you are here, he said. In this court, which has been a place where what is known and what is said have been managed into an arrangement that suited certain people. Now you have painted what you know on a canvas that 400 people can see. He paused. What happens to you next is not, I am aware that it is not automatically safe. My word is not automatically enough, given what this morning has shown about the distance between my word and what has been done in my name. I know, she said. I want to be honest with you about what I can offer, he said, and the quality of it, the particular, careful honesty of a powerful person who has just been shown the limits of their own power and is choosing to acknowledge them rather than perform around them, landed in her chest with the weight of something real. I cannot offer you certainty. I can offer you my intention, Sue, which is to begin correcting what I understand now has been significantly uncorrected, and to begin here, with you, with this morning. Sable sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it meant to receive an honest acknowledgement of limits from someone who was accustomed to being expected to project limitlessness. She thought about the cost he was choosing here, in this moment, not as large a cost as the one she had chosen, perhaps, but chosen in the same direction, toward honesty rather than management. I can work with intention, she said. Yes, he said. I thought you might. Outside the hall, in the corridors that connected Valdenmoor's corridors of power to the rest of the world, she could hear the sound of things beginning to move differently than they had moved before. New configurations, new patterns of footstep and voice and decision. The grinding, slow, enormous sound of a machine being asked to reconsider. It was not a small sound. It was also not a clean one. It was the sound of something complicated and difficult and entirely necessary, and she knew from the inside, the way she knew the things she painted, that it had only just started and would require everything from a great many people for a long time. She also knew, with the same settled certainty, that it had started. The painting, she said, will need to be officially received by the assembly. Yes. Without council interpretation. Yes. Lady Vane, she said, seems to have opinions about how to proceed. Something moved in his voice, something small and surprised and, she thought, genuine. She has been waiting, he said, to have those opinions be of use, for approximately 30 years, by her own account. Then she should be listened to. She is being listened to, he said, currently and extensively. A pause. Something in the quality of the silence between them had changed, was less formal, less careful, less the silence of a seer and a king navigating a professional and political precipice, and more the silence of two people sitting near each other, in the aftermath of something large, catching their breath. What is your name? He asked. Your full name, not the seer designation. Sable, she said. Just Sable. Sable, he said. Just the name, trying its weight. Did you eat this morning? She paused. No. Then that is the next thing, he said, and stood. She heard him stand. Ye heard the shift of fabric and the particular sound of a large person rising from an undignified position. Steps, not thrown, without caring about the undignity of it. She heard him turn toward her and extend a hand she could not see. Lady Vane has commandeered the East Gallery. There is food, I'm told, and considerably less theater. Sable found her cane. She reached out her other hand, not toward where she thought he was standing, but slightly to the left, in the direction the sound suggested. His hand found hers. Warm, steady. She stood. "The painting will stay displayed?" she asked. "For as long as the assembly deems necessary," he said. "Which I expect will be some time." "Good," she said. She let him guide her toward the hall's side exit, not because she needed guiding, but because the offer had been made honestly, and she had decided, in the specific and particular way she made decisions, that this was a person she could accept honesty from. Behind them, on the canvas 8 feet by 6, the crimson held its urgency, and the shadows wore their ordinary faces, and the figure at the threshold looked outward at something that had not yet been determined. The painting waited, as true things wait, without impatience, without revision, certain of its own content and asking nothing of the viewer except that they look. 400 people were looking. It was, Sable thought, exactly enough.